Hello, everybody, and welcome and thank you to everyone who's tuned in this Wednesday lunchtime for what we hope will be another exciting BIC Live session. This week, we are hearing from the Bats in Churches engagement officers, Honor, Rose and Diana, who are going to take us through some of the ways in which they have been helping communities, bats and churches to find common ground. They will each be giving a short talk and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So please do pop anything that springs to mind into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen during the session, and we'll either answer it live down there or we'll come to it at the end. And anything we don't come to at the end, feel free to email us with those questions and we'll answer personally. We also have some questions that you asked as part of the registration. So we'll be coming to those at the end as well. We've got those. A little bit about the project for those of you that aren't familiar with it, although I'd imagine a lot of you are. The Bats in Churches project is a unique cross-pollination between Natural England, the Church of England, the Bat Conservation Trust and the Churches Conservation Trust and Historic England that was created to address the issues that bats can cause in churches while continuing to protect their roosts. The project is working with over 100 churches and is running for 5 years in total. The project is now in its 3rd year, time really does fly, I must say, and was made possible by a grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Honor Gay, who looks after our project churches in the South and Southwest. So Honor, wherever you're ready, you're on mute at the moment, but charge ahead. Honor, you need to unmute yourself.
Fantastic. That is a really rocky start, but I'm here now, so that's really good. Hello, everyone. I'm Honor Gay, as Ione has said, and I have the pleasure of working with about just over 30 churches between ranging from Lincolnshire to Cornwall. And I am going to talk to you, spend about 5 minutes talking to you about 2 very different churches where the project has worked with church communities to find 2 very different solutions to help them live alongside their bats. So I'm going to start with St Nicholas, Chignall Smealy, near Chelmsford in Essex. And as you can see, this is not your quintessential English parish church because it's built of brick. And not only brick, but Tudor brick from the 16th century. It's almost all brick with really, really marvelous detailing. Grade 2 star, and here is the interior. You can see it's a small and fairly simple church, but the brick makes it really striking and picturesque. And for me, best of all, there is a brick font. Now, brick churches, medieval brick churches in England are not that usual, but brick fonts are vanishingly rare. Sadly, this isn't unique. There are a very small number of other brick fonts in England, but it is really not usual at all. Chignall Smealy is part of a group of 10 churches, 6 of which are still open. And this church, Mashbury, is closed and currently used as an agricultural store. And I'm showing you again this wonderful brick detailing in the porch. So that's really the church. What about the bats? Chignall Smealy is inhabited by at least 2 species of bats. Here we have the Natteras Bat, which is relatively common in churches and very loyal to their roosts. You'll hear more about Natteras bats from Rose and Diana, and also the very cute brown long-eared bat. Now, we don't know a huge amount about the bats at Chignall Smealy because the community is really able to keep on top of the cleaning, and the presence of the bats doesn't really disrupt worship or affect the functioning of the church. So we didn't commission a Bats in Churches survey here. What the church community was concerned about was the damage that particularly bat urine, does to the heritage And here you see some rather fine Victorian tiles, and you can very, very clearly see the characteristic white pitting, which is superficial damage to the tiles, and even more obvious on this memorial slab. So what did we do? Here also, you can see of particular concern to the PCC, you can see this very obvious characteristic urine splattering on the war memorial, which is really upsetting and unsightly. So what did we do? Our heritage advisor, Rachel Arnold, who's an expert conservator, worked with the PCC to design, commission and install these really discreet and appropriate frames to protect the memorials. You can see here it's open. There's a very nice dark oak surround and an openable glass lid. And you can see it here in position in the nave looking west. And as Rachel said, you know, it looks as if it's always been here. When Mashbury Church was closed, the war memorial was moved from Mashbury to Chignal Smealy. And you can see we also designed and installed a small frame here. And at this point, I just want to do a shout out for all the cleaning and conservation guidance that the project, well, that Rachel is developing for the project. You can see there's conservation cleaning guide, there's guide to monumental brasses, and there's also a lot of information on the Church of England Church Care website as well. As I said, the church community is Chignal Smealy is active and dynamic. And this year we're hoping to work with the wonderful Essex Bat group to plan a bat walk, and also working with the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings to do a talk on Tudor brickwork. So if you're anywhere near Chelmsford, do keep a lookout for those events. So moving on to St Lawrence, Willington, and in many ways this is much more of the quintessential English parish church. It was completely rebuilt in the 16th century by a man called John Gostwycke. John Gostwycke lived in the reign of Henry VIII. For those of you maybe joining from overseas, Henry is pictured in the top right of the, oh, maybe top left. Anyway, he is the grand looking chap with the beard facing us at the top. And John Gostwycke navigated successfully the turbulent times under working both for Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell. He held important positions under both of them and made a lot of money. And he completely rebuilt the church, and he also built a wonderful manor house, which sadly doesn't survive, but only these incredible castellated structures, a stable and a dovecot. Here you see the interior. Incredible survivals in the care of the National Trust, surviving today, no trace of the manor house. Inside the church are some important monuments, this marvellous effigy of William Gostwycke, and a replica of the helmet which John Gostwycke wore to the field of the cloth of gold. When I walked into the church in Willington, truly, it was one of the most badly affected churches by bats I had been in. Not only, despite the best efforts of active cleaners, there was a lot of bat mess and it was quite smelly. And what we've done is we've made a video that can tell you what we did in Willington far better than I can. So this is the point at which we cross our fingers and hope the technology works and I don't have to extemporize and say what we did at Willington. Over to you, Ione.
We love conservation. We love the environment and conservation and looking after God's world. It's living with the effects of having some of the conservation within the building. It's not like having them in your loft at home, for example. It's more like having them in your dining room.
Rather than looking at it as destructive, there's a lot of negative interaction. In other words, where the bats are roosting, there'll be droppings falling out of the roost onto the floor. So somebody's got to come in and do a lot of cleaning before all these events take place.
Particularly for those who have the role of being volunteer cleaners, it's disheartening. They can come in and clean and spend 2 or 3 hours cleaning, and then they go home and within a couple of hours, it's as if they'd never been here.
They don't want to get rid of the bats, they just want to reduce the burden the bats are placing on them and the church so that they can carry on the functions of the church. So a lot of my challenge is about how to try and solve that, how to accommodate both the needs of the people whilst also bats.
The reason that bats like buildings like this is it's the closest they can get probably to ancient woodland. And what you've got here is a tall enclosed place like a woodland ride with nice wooden structures up at the top, like the tops of trees where they can find roosts. So it's an ideal place for them.
So last year we did 4 surveys here, dawn and dusk. In fact, I actually slept here the night between the surveys, which was lovely. I slept, I think, where we're sitting now. But what it meant is we could watch the bats' behaviour. From the bats would come out of a beam at the top of the roof. They'll fly around inside the church, circling around before they gather at the chancel and exit the building through the small gap in the stained glass window. They'll then fly off and forage. They might come back occasionally during the night, so you've got regular bats coming in and out, but the bulk of the activity is at dusk. And then at dawn, they tend to gather outside the church, outside the stained glass window where there's a hole. They'll, again, socialise, chattering away before entering inside the church.
It was a very interesting case, this, because it was important for the ecologist, Chris, to find out how bats were using the church. And he then came forward with proposals. One, to filter the bats coming into the church into a new bat box inside the chancel. Now, that was going to be quite obvious, and therefore the architect designed a new hatchment, effectively, a modern hatchment to cover the bat box and make it seem fitting and appropriate within the church.
So once we've a new external access point to where they're roosting, we can look at potentially creating a new roosting point around the bat access, which is how we arrived at creating a rather charming bespoke bat box with heraldic shields on it that honour some of the historical families associated with the church.
I think what we're looking at now is a longer term relationship between the bat group and hopefully quite a few church communities, not just in Willington but in other places as well.
So we've got the bats and our responsibility to them. We've got the building and our responsibility as stewards of a beautiful historic building. And we've also got the living community, the church, the people who meet here week in, week out, and the people from the village for whom this is their church. And now, with the introduction of the Bats in Churches class licences, all 3 of those have an equal voice.
Thank you for that. I'll say a big thank you to Joel Court, who was the filmmaker who helped us make that film. Well, he made the whole film. We didn't help, but he was wonderful. So thank you. And like I said, you'll be able to watch that on our website and also on the Watch Again link for this talk. So moving on, thank you so much, Honor, for that. We now will have Rose Riddell, who will be telling us a bit about her churches that she looks after in the North and the Midlands. Whenever you're ready, Rose.
Lovely, thank you so much, Ione. North Midlands and a few counties that you don't think are in the North and Midlands. So I've got some churches down in Somerset and North Bucks, stretching up to one church in the Lake District, across to the North Yorkshire, but most of them are in the Midlands. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 churches in my talk. The first one is All Saints Braunston in Rutland. And this is one of our pilot churches. It's a Church of England church, grade 2-star. The next one is a grade 1 listed church, St Lawrence in Radstone in Northamptonshire. And the third church I'm going to be looking at is Holcombe Old Church in Somerset, which is cared for by the Churches Conservation Trust. So this was All Saints Braunston. It's a very pretty church. It's got a couple of historic medieval wall paintings in the south aisle. There have always been small numbers of bats roosting in All Saints, but about 10 years ago, a chimney in an old cottage in the village fell down. The chimney was a roost site for a large colony of more than 600 soprano pipistrelles. The bats had to find a new home pretty quickly, and they found their way into the south aisle roof of the church that you can see here in the picture, getting in underneath the eaves. Old churches always have holes in them, and bats can squeeze through very small spaces. So you can see here the main access points to the south aisle roof void, and the droppings are a telltale giveaway. So it would have been fine if them being in the south aisle roof void, but unfortunately there were also holes to the inside of the church, inside. And this is where the bats were able to get into the church and fly around socialising before they went out foraging for the evening. And also the holes enabled all the droppings from the roost in the south aisle to fall through into the south aisle. And you can see here that the church wardens did their best to protect the wall paintings by hanging netting material over them and putting down paper to pick up the bulk of the droppings. But it still required hours of cleaning beforehand before the church could be used for worship or for village events. And the situation got so bad that they were contemplating having to close. So in desperation, they contacted their local MP, and to cut a very long story short, they came to be one of our 3 pilot churches during the development stage of the Bats in Churches project in 2016 and 2018. So the project appointed an ecologist, Dr. Lottie Patman, to survey the church to find out exactly how the bats were using it. And she concluded they did not need to fly around inside. The holes in the ceiling were blocked temporarily with car sponge, and monitoring showed bat numbers actually increased after the temporary blocking. And so in April 2019, the blocking was made permanent, and you can see here a corbel being replaced, and the holes were being filled. So this meant the bats could still access the roof void from the outside, but they could no longer get inside the church. And to provide them with some additional accommodation, we also put up a triple bat box on a pole in a field next to the churchyard. I think it's important to stress that the solutions we have developed or we are working towards at our churches are very much bespoke. All churches are different, and different bat species have different ecological requirements. So what works at one church might not necessarily work at another. So back to Braunston. The monitoring again showed the bat numbers remaining healthy. And in August 2019, we held a celebration beer and bats night with the local pub. The church warden talked about how the church became involved in the project and how successful it had been. And Leicestershire and Rutland Bat Group gave a really interesting talk about bats and brought along bat detectors for people to use. It was a lovely summer evening. More than 100 people turned up, and the bats put on a great display at dusk, swooping out from under the eaves to lots of oohs and ahs from the bat detectors as they were going off. So this was a good news story. It was picked up by BBC East Midlands and some of the national newspapers, and it even got as far as Fox News in North America. So for those of you with a nervous disposition, I suggest you turn away now, because the next slide is not very pleasant. So this is what we found when visiting St Lawrence in Radstone for the first time in May 2019. As you can see, there are droppings and debris absolutely everywhere, and quite a lot of dead bats, and it really didn't smell very brilliant either. This is a Natteras bat, like the bat that Honor talked about. This is a Natteras bat inside Radstone Church Tower. Radstone Church actually shelters a nationally important colony of Natteras bats, more than 300 at the highest count. And the bats were using the whole of the church space as a roost site. It eventually got so bad that the church volunteers could no longer keep up on the cleaning. And in 2016, the church very sadly had to close. The church has not always been a bat roost site, however. So during our works at Radstone last year, we found this rather sweet poem. which suggests that in the mid-1990s, when it was written, finding a bat in the church was actually a very unusual occurrence. So a bat was found behind the hymn board, and it inspired one Alan J. Poole to not just write this poem, but also to illustrate it and frame it and hang it in the church. So back to Radstone. So we employed an ecologist, Chris Damant, who we saw in the video, to survey the church to find out exactly how the bats are using it. And he found they were getting in via a hole in the chancel roof, which you should be able to see with the red arrow. If you look at the ceilings of the nave and the chancel, you see that they are different. And this suggested a potential solution for the bat mitigation at St. Lawrence. So the nave ceiling is medieval and it's historically very, very significant. The chancel ceiling, the medieval chancel ceiling, was actually taken out by Victorians, and they replaced it with this scissor beam arrangement. So it's not as historically significant as the nave ceiling. So working with Historic England, the Victorian Society and the church architect, Chris came up with the idea of boarding between these scissor beams to create a flight space and roosting space for the bats above the chancel, basically creating a chancel ceiling where there wasn't one before, and still retaining the bats' access points with the red arrows. And this just gives a better idea of what it looks like, looking towards the east side of the church. And this is what the ceiling looks like after the work was done, which was in September and October 2020. And it has actually significantly lightened the chancel. The church warden and the community are thrilled with it. The bats are now going to be left to habituate to the new arrangements. And once the ecologist Chris is happy they're using the new roost area, the access to the main body of the church will be closed off. They will still have a roost in the church, but they won't be able to actually get into the church. And we expect this to happen this autumn. So we have gone from this in May 2019 to December, Christmas service 2020. And the church was actually able to have service and use the church as a place of worship for the first time in many years. So for my final church, any Poldark fans here might recognise this church. This is Holcombe Church. It stood in for Saul Church in Poldark, I think in episodes 3 and 4, I believe. It's cared for by the church's Conservation Trust, and it's home to a small colony of quite a rare bat species in the UK, lesser horseshoe bats. Unlike pipistrelle bats and Natteras bats, lesser horseshoes form mixed sex maternity colonies in the summer. So in the right-hand picture is the photographer standing in the nave looking down towards the tower. Now the bats used to roost in the tower, but we think they were disturbed when some repair work was done quite a few years ago. And they found their way into the church underneath the church door. And they're now roosting in the chancel. And the CCT and the church cleaners have to put covers down over the pews to protect them from the droppings and the urine. And they've also put up this sort of sail-like structure in the chancel roof, which is it's a bat nappy. However, it does catch some of the droppings, but certainly not all of them. Doesn't do that much for the smell. So that's sort of designed to sort of protect the church. So the plan at this church, we're working with the local ecologist, Adrian Coward, who is very kindly providing his services free of charge. So this is on the left-hand side, you can see this is the access point under the church door, where the doorstep has been worn over thousands of years by people's feet. And what the ecologist is doing here is opening up the tower, created a shelter structure here, so the tower is enhanced for the bats, and also opened up the nave roof space as well. So they've got some extra roosting spaces. Once they're using the tower again and the nave roof void, we're going to make sure there's no bats left in the church and just simply use a simple draft excluder in keeping with the heritage of the church, just to prevent them coming back into the church. And we're hoping to complete this work in 2021. So that's me over and done with, and I'm going to hand back to Ione.
Thank you very much, Rose, for taking us through those churches. Some lovely pictures there. I can see there's some questions coming in the Q&A, so thank you very much. And please do continue to put your questions there, and we'll come to any that we haven't answered at the end. I'm now going to pass on to Diana Spencer, who is looking after our churches in East Anglia, of which there are quite a few, as you can see.
Thanks, Ione. Yes, so I'm Diana. I'm the engagement officer for Eastern England. As you can see from the map of my churches, primarily Norfolk, but also some of the surrounding counties as well in Suffolk and Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. We've got a real concentration of project churches in Norfolk for a number of reasons. Partly, Norfolk simply has an awful lot of very, very big medieval churches, which are particularly attractive to bats. It's also an area that's losing quite a lot of its natural bat habitat, obviously quite agricultural, not very wooded compared to some counties. And we do think there's been quite a lot of loss of other buildings, barns, farm buildings in conversion to holiday homes or new houses as well. There's also been a lot of work done in Norfolk with bats in churches, with Phil Parker and the Norfolk Bats in Churches project and various other studies as well. So we had a really big pool of churches in the area to try and help. So we're just going to focus on 3 of them today. Saxlingham up there near the north coast, Swanton Morley right smack bang in the middle of the county, and Hardwick just down south of Norwich. So we look at Little Hardwick first, and this is it. This is a really, really pretty church, quite a small church, mostly Norman with a little bit of Saxon work in there as well. Did used to have a round tower at the end. You can just see the stump of it there, but this came down in about 1770 and was never rebuilt, leaving this really nice, simple, plain looking building. But it's got a lovely interior, really pretty carved screen. You can just see in the picture on the right-hand side there, there's an old Jacobean box pew, which is now used as the vestry, which still has some of the original paintwork on it. So it's a really nice church inside, but the real glory of this church is this amazing wall painting on the north side of the church. The one on the right is a very recent photograph. The one on the left is a late Victorian copy or reconstruction. We think there's probably quite a lot of detail in there that might not have been visible at the time. But this is a 14th century St. Christopher carrying the Christ child. And you can see it's full of birds and patterns. And down in the bottom left of the reconstruction there, you can see a picture of a fisherman. And we think this is one of the earliest depictions of an angler in British medieval art. So we're particularly worried about the mess inside the church and damage to the painting as well. So we had surveys at this church in 2019, and we found it's actually due to quite a small number of bats, mostly common pipistrelles, and we have recorded a ceratine there as well. We also commissioned a professional report on the condition of the wall painting to see how badly that was being damaged and if bats were the culprit or if other things were involved as well. So that's Andrea up there inspecting the painting. And combining the ecologist's report and the condition of the painting, we decided that because this was such a small number of bats and there was such a high risk of damage to the painting, we could in this case actually move the bats out of the interior of the building. So the plan here, and this has sadly obviously been delayed by the COVID works and things recently, but is to put up an exterior pole. This is obviously the one from Braunston, but gives you an idea of what it will be like. And some bat boxes on the exterior of the church. And then the bats will be moved out of the interior of the church completely at this point. There are some bat boxes in the roof here that were put in 2015 as well. But that will hopefully completely solve the problem inside the church and protect the lovely wall painting. And then they can look at conserving the painting as well without worrying that it will be damaged further. Very, very different to Hardwick is this vast perpendicular church at Swanton Morley. This is one of the famous wall churches of Norfolk, these huge, rich churches built in the sort of late 14th, early 15th century, this one. Big perpendicular windows all along one side. And it sits in this gorgeous location above the Wensum Valley. You can see the valley sweeping away. And you can see immediately why this is such a wonderful habitat for bats with all these feeding options and routes down to the river. It's a very, very active church. They want to do a lot. They have a lot of children's activities. This was taken at the Flower Festival. And not a lot of medieval survivals inside, but you can see these tulip-shaped bench ends. These are 17th century and really quite rare in the area. So this is home to quite a large colony of Natteras bats again. They were coming in at the east end of the chancel, flying up and down and roosting above the tower arch. You can just see on the left some of the speckles above the tower arch there where they were roosting. And on the right gives you an idea of just the size of this church and how hard this must be for a relatively small PCC to try and keep clean. So this was surveyed in 2018 as part of our pilot project. And we decided that we could build some new roosts for the Natteras bats in the chancel eaves, which would give them an entrance, a roosting point and space to fly around above the wall void there, but keep them out of the interior of the church. So this is Robson Construction and Wild Wings Ecology, putting the boxes in, a little bit of work both outside and inside, gives you an idea of the location. And there's a close-up of the boxes. And we've also in this case installed some little night vision cameras in the boxes. So not only can we use that to monitor that the boxes are being used, and this is some footage of a very fat Natteras bat that's had a very successful evening hunting, trying its best to squeeze into the roosting gaps there. So we know these boxes are being used successfully, and they were monitored throughout 2019 to make sure the bats were using them quite happily. And then this summer, we've blocked off the access from these boxes into the inside of the church. So the bats can now access the boxes, but can no longer get inside the church. And this just gives you an idea of the view of the boxes now they're installed from the outside and the inside. So you can see, you might just be able to make out the new screws holding the underside of the box in place in that right-hand picture. But everything's stained. So actually these boxes from the inside are virtually invisible unless you know they're there. So they make a really, really minor change to the inside of the church. And then our final church to tell you about in Norfolk is Saxlingham, up here in this beautiful, beautiful situation near the north coast. This is originally a medieval church, but it was very, very heavily restored in the late 1890s. So the interior is particularly Victorian now. It does still have some lovely things in it. This is a Bevington organ that actually came from a church in London and was moved up to Saxlingham in the late 1960s. And you can see that this has suffered some bat damage. You can see the spotting on the brass sections of the bottom of the pipes there. It also has some very, very early alabaster statues. These are formerly part of a monument to Lady Mirabell Haydon and the family that built the church at Saxlingham. And this was formerly part of a huge Egyptian style tomb with a great big pyramid and colonnades. And that was all put in. She died in about 1593. Sadly, the monument itself became derelict and was taken to pieces in the late 1780s. But the statue of Lady Haydon and some small bits and pieces like this lovely alabaster Bible still survive in the middle of the church. So like I said, quite a Victorian interior aside from those survivals, but this was an incredibly badly affected church. This is Natteras Bats again, and it was a big roost of potentially well over 100 bats in this church. And it was the only church that our ecologist won't stop in overnight because of the amount of mess and droppings and urine that was just constantly falling from the ceiling. And compared to Swanton and Morley, where the Natteras used the church in quite a simple way, here at Saxlingham, they used several different access points, they roosted in several different places, and they used the interior of the church quite a lot as well. So we had to do something a little bit more complicated than simply putting in rafter boxes here. So after a lot of discussion with the PCC and the diocese and the ecologist and the church architects, we've decided to put the bat loft in this transept. This is the north transept. That lower half where the door is currently used as the vestry. We know the bats do access into the roof here and use this area of the church. So the plan is, and this is underway at the moment, to turn the whole top half of this transept into a bespoke bat loft that the bats will be able to use and then keep out of the interior of the church. So phase one has gone in already. You can see these are some extra roosting features and bat boxes we've built under the eaves there. And the next stage is to put a roof across at the top level of the top of the screen. And then we're going to extend this screen up to fill in that gap between the top of the screen and the top of the arch. And the screening there will be wooden again with a door in it so people can go in and clean the bat loft out. and it will be carved and patterned to match that lower screen at the bottom. As you can imagine, this is going to be quite a big visual impact on the church itself. So we've had to go through a long process of consultation with all the various authorities. We've had to have full faculty from the diocese and obviously the PCC as well. But everyone is really agreed that even though this will be a slight change visually to the church, it will give the PCC their church back effectively and give the bats a nice, safe home tucked away in their new bat loft. And we're hoping the work here will be going on in March this year. And so fingers crossed this time next year, we'll be able to show you quite a serious difference to the inside of the church. I'll hand you back to Ione, and I think we've got some questions to answer.
Thank you very much for that. We have got some questions. We've got lots of questions. We've got some questions which you asked us before during the registration, like I mentioned. So we'll come to those now. We've got about 20 minutes, so we've got lots of time to go over those. So I will plow ahead with those. The first question we had in advance of the talk was, what type of roosts are there usually in churches? So Diana, if you want to answer that question.
Yeah, and so the majority of the roosts we get in our churches, and certainly the ones that tend to cause issues for the church, are maternity roosts. So that's primarily female bats in the church in the summer, and they go up in the roost and they have their kits, they have their pups up there in the roost. And that tends to be the ones that cause most of the problems. They usually sit on the south side of the church in the nice warm sections. And it's a mix then of the number of bats coming together, the increased numbers because they're breeding, and also because the young bats like to use the inside of the church as a really nice, safe flight space. So they're the ones we're looking at mostly, are the ones that are there in the summer. You do get smaller roosts called transitional roosts, where bats move between maternity and their winter roosts, and we see a few of those as well. You do get some bats that hibernate in churches, but on the whole, bats hibernating want somewhere quite cold, quite damp, very undisturbed. So they tend to be in the tower space, in the crypt, places like that. So while you do see hibernation roosts in churches, they don't tend to cause as much of a problem as the maternity roosts do. So yeah, the vast majority of the roosts we're working with are summer maternity roosts. Bats are there between March and September, roughly.
It always surprises me that bats want to hibernate somewhere cold and damp.
Yeah. Yeah, it means they can drop their body temperature right down and go into that torpor that's the hibernation there.
Makes sense. Biology has the answer, of course. So the next question we have is, how are bats protected while the repairs are carried out? Should we give that question to Rose?
Let me go with that. Well, as Diana said, we're actually dealing with, mostly we're actually dealing with maternity roosts, which are present in the church between sort of May and September. So the work is carried out before the bats return to the roosts or after. So either in the sort of early months of the year or later on in the autumn. So that way, you know, we know we're not going to be disturbing any bats. The work that we do is supervised by the ecologist, who needs to be present when any work that might impact on the bats or the bat roost that might happen. And we also make sure that the architect and the contractors that we use have all been briefed beforehand, and the PCC, on the law to do with bats and what to do if they find a bat. Work must stop and that sort of thing. So we do have quite sort of strict controls, very strict controls in place to make sure that no bats are harmed and there's no disturbance, unnecessary disturbance to the roosts.
Thank you, Rose. I hope that answered your question. So I'll just quickly nip to one of the questions which we had live before we come back to some more pre-questions. We've had a question, and I believe this did come up in some of the pre-questions as well, was what do you do about a build-up of droppings within the bat boxes that are put within churches? Is that a worry, and are there systems in place for sorting that out? I'll put that to the group, whoever wants to dive in.
I can do that one. Yes, so We do sometimes need to clean the boxes out. Some of the rafter boxes are simply designed so they're on an angle, so any droppings that build up in them will simply drop outside the church and drop into the ground. In other areas, we've built in a little section that you can unscrew and then go in and clean the droppings out in the winter when the bats aren't there. I mentioned in the bit when we were talking about Saxlingham, in that loft, there's actually going to be a doorway that you can simply open and go up with a ladder and clean out. We know that does mean there is a little bit of maintenance, but it's significantly less than the maintenance involved in cleaning the church. And the plan for most of our churches is that that will just go into their usual maintenance schedule. So when they have their guttering cleaned and the roof checked, which most churches do on a regular basis, while they're up there, they will also quickly clean out the bat box to make sure the droppings don't build up. I mean, bats do roost in lots of areas in churches that are completely inaccessible, and you don't often get a problem with dropping build-up. They do tend to crumble away. But yeah, most of our boxes are designed with some sort of access so people can get in and clean them out as easily as possible. You still muted, Ione, sorry.
Well, in Zoom, you always think you're on top of it and then it catches you out when you're least expecting it, doesn't it? Every time. So we'll go to another pre-question now. How large is the bat population residing in our churches? Honor, I think that it's time you answer the question.
Right, super, I'm unmuted. Well, this is, on the first level, this is a very simple answer. We don't know. We have a lot of evidence that the population of bats in churches is increasing. And we find throughout the project, we get contacted by churches who are not project churches who have issues with bats or want to learn more about their bats. But this is a great moment to put a plug in for an aspect of the project that we're not talking about today, which my colleague Claire Boothby is running, which is that we are planning, this project is such a great opportunity to learn more about the distribution of bats in churches in England. And Claire is running a volunteer survey, which you can sign up for, which is happening every summer for the rest of the project, so every summer till 2023, where we are asking volunteers, and particularly any of you from church communities, you are the best volunteers because you know your churches and you have access to them, volunteers to select churches and survey them for bats. And this is ever so simple. You need to collect a dropping sample and we get it analysed. Claire, I'm not sure if I've explained that as well as you could. I don't know if you want to come in here from your blank photo. Ah, I must have done it perfectly. There we go.
I'll just add a note to say that there is, not to complicate things, there's lots of details about those surveys and how to get involved on our website. So please do take a look, and you can get involved. You don't need any experience to do them, and they're for the simplest level, you just need to look for evidence of bats in the churches. That's just urine and dropping samples. And then if you want to take it up a notch, you can collect some droppings and put out a bat detector. But like I said, if you're interested in doing that, and I hope that lots of you are, then please do go on our website and take a look. And hopefully we'll see lots of you doing that next summer. Moving on, thank you, Honor, for that. We've got a question here about the consequences of habitat loss on bats. Yeah, I don't know, Honor, you're...
it's me again. I think there is a lot of project that bats have moved into churches as a result of nearby loss of habitat. I have a church in Suffolk where bats were first recorded when nearby trees were felled for a bypass. Diana also mentioned the preponderance of churches in Norfolk in a very agriculturally improved landscape. And so churches, really, they are a complex, stable building. And of course, the churchyard also has is often the only place, especially places like East Anglia, where there is any semi-natural habitat, plants providing foods for insects. So really, I tend to think of churches as providing sanctuary for bats, as they did for criminals in the Middle Ages.
Fantastic, thank you, Honor. That's quite the image you've left us with there. I'm sort of thinking of criminal bats now, but okay. So there's another question here about which. Oh, well, actually, I'll go to a live question now again, which was relating to Rose's churches, and there was a picture of a poll box on one of your churches, and the question is, I believe, was it Braunston? How successful have those poll boxes been?
All right, I've just replied privately to that question, but we don't know yet. Because they're fairly recent, and bat boxes, you need to leave them for several years sometimes before the bats start to use them. So we will be checking them this summer, and hopefully we'll have a few bats in residence in them. But at the moment, it's just a bit too early to say.
Understandable. They probably take a while. I don't know, but no doubt they take a while to kind of discover it and move in. So, and another question for you, Rose, is which bat species have been recorded in churches?
Quite a lot. So we have 17 breeding species of bats in the UK, and more than half of them have been recorded as using churches. So the most common species that we find in churches are brown long-eared bats, woodland species, both the pipistrelles and Natteras bats. Natteras bats in Norfolk in particular, churches, as Honor said, and Diana, are really important for them. We've also got Daubenton's, we get lesser and greater horseshoes, serotins, and we also have a few Barbastell, Wiskard and Brant records. And of course, our volunteer surveys are going to be shedding much more light on this.
Fantastic. Oops, thank you. Thanks so much, Rose, for that. I think that there's one more question here. So yes, this came in right before the session, so we have got plenty of time to answer it. And I know it's quite a complicated question, so I didn't want to ask it unless I was sure we had a bit of time to answer it. So the question is, I'll just read it as it was asked. As our church is also a community centre and food is regularly served here, which is actually often the case with many churches. So we've had this question many, many times before. Having bats flying around and dropping their mess is causing hygiene problems. Is there a way we can discourage bats from entering the church and keep them out? Or can you recommend anything to distract them away from certain areas? However, it is an open space. Diana, do you want to dive into that one? It's quite a big topic.
Yes, it is. It's a very
the whole
question. We can't give you a really specific answer for your church, obviously, because as Rose said earlier on, every single church is different and the mitigation options would be different. A couple of things I would say. Firstly, just to reassure, I know it is incredibly unpleasant if you're serving food and drink and there's bat mess and there's bat droppings and the mess is, awful. There aren't any, as found if you were on our talk last week, there aren't any actual diseases you can catch from that, which is not me saying it's acceptable at all, because obviously it's not something you want to be dealing with, but hopefully that might just reassure a little bit. The mitigation options that we're running as part of the project are things that churches can do independently. The licenses can be used by any ecologist who's trained to use them. So you're more than capable of looking at doing this mitigation work yourself. It's not cheap, depending on the solutions, but it is there as an option. And we're completely happy to advise on some of that if you'd like a bit more information. Simpler things you can do that I know a lot of our churches do is to simply install a covered space inside the church. So that might be putting a roof over a vestry, or simply putting up one of those outdoor gazebos, little pop-up gazebos that you can put up and have your food and drink served under that, which will keep everything nice and clean. We have to say, using things like deterrents, it is still illegal to disturb a roost or disturb a bat, and that includes things like audio deterrence and light deterrence. And they can only be used in very special circumstances and under license. We have had some tests with things like audio deterrence, and they actually don't necessarily solve the problem at all. This is just from a couple of churches we've worked with, so there is more research about this available. But sometimes the bats will get used to them and come back. Sometimes you are moving the bats somewhere else, but you have no control over where the bats are going to go once you've moved them from one place, and they might actually end up somewhere far more unpleasant and not useful from where you want them to be. So we would absolutely advise not doing that if you possibly can. Like I said, it is illegal unless you do have a license. But we'd recommend potentially call the National Bat Helpline if you're looking at doing works, talk to your local bat roost. If you can, contact an ecologist. They may be able to give you an idea of how the bats are using the church, where they're coming in and out, and some options for mitigation. But yeah, don't forget the things like putting up canopies or covers you can do without disturbing the bats particularly, and that can sometimes be a really good sort of quick fix if you want to use your church space. I hope this is a very complex question, and it's really hard to give a really specific answer for a specific case. But if you would like any help, like I said, depending on where you are, get in touch with myself or Rose or Honor, and we can put you in touch with the right people in your area who might be able to help you.
Thanks, Diana. That was really good. That was a really, really good answer. So just to say as well on that, we have a lot of resources, and those resources are increasing often. We've got resources pages on our website, so please do have a look. And like Diana said, if you have any questions or you'd like any specific advice, we would love to help. Please do email us. You'll see the contact form on the website as well, if you'd like to do that. That is all we have time for. We're actually going to finish on time, which is positive, definitely. Thank you to everyone for coming. It's been really nice to have the opportunity to talk a bit more just about really what the project is doing as part of BIC Live. We should be offering a few more BIC Live sessions this year, so keep an eye out for those as well. If you're signed up for the newsletter, you'll receive the dates and registration information, and if you're not, please do sign up or have a look on our Twitter or keep an eye out on our webpage. You'll also be able to watch this episode and last week's again from the same webpage on our website which you used to register. And that watch again link, which you can share with anyone, of course, should be up in the next, probably by the end of tomorrow, I would say. The only final thing to say is that when you close this, when you leave the meeting, you'll see on your browser that there's a survey. The survey, the feedback survey will also be on the follow-up email. So please do fill that out if you have 5 minutes or 2 minutes to do that. It's really helpful for us so we can make sure that any future events are really good. So that leaves me with nothing else to say other than thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, our engagement officers who are working really, really hard with all of their churches. And thank you to everyone who took the time out at lunchtime to learn a little bit more about bats in churches. So thank you, everyone, and we'll leave it there. Enjoy your lunches, and goodbye from all of us.